G'day, guys. This is looking at frailty and looking at the consequences of species inappropriate diet. It's looking at a number of things, and it's a bit of an extrapolation on my side. So do bear with me as we go through some of that information. Okay, so I'll just share my screen, get things rolling. Okay, this condition called polymyositis. So polymyositis is an uncommon inflammatory disease that causes muscle weakness affecting both sides of the body. Having this condition can make it difficult to climb stairs, rise from the seated position, lift objects, or reach overhead. So this can affect adults in their 30s, 40s and 50s. It's more common in people with African descent, blacks, than in whites. Women are affected more than men. Signs and symptoms usually develop gradually over years, weeks and months. So anyway, we'll go into it and it'll make more sense, this sort of condition. So here we've got a study on hypokalemic episodes in polymyopathy in cats fed a vegetarian diet. So that's the sort of connection. This condition is basically this type of condition we're talking about. So in previously undocumented hypokalemic, low potassium, that is, conditions with cyclical nature comprising acute bouts of polymyopathy, followed by spontaneous recoveries, is described in the cat. Cats being fed a high protein vegetarian diet develop recurring episodes of polymyopathy characterized by ventroflexion of the head and neck, stiff forelimbs, gout, lateral head resting, and generalized muscle weakness. So, which is what we see in a lot of elderly people as well, this sort of effect. So plasma potassium concentrations, they looked at them, they saw were reduced quite markedly from 3.28 to 0.33 millimoles at the beginning of the experiment to 2.45 to 0.24. Now, there were two groups. There was one which was given and one which wasn't given potassium and also taurine as well. This hypokalemia was associated with increased creatine kinase. So obviously activities indicated muscle damage and decreased urinary potassium concentrations, and was caused by insufficient dietary potassium. So obviously eating kibble, feeding the cats kibble obviously would do it. And this is the same thing with a lot of people eating, poor quality proteins and stuff like that. Humans, this sort of plants being a rich source of potassium and stuff like that, there's a lot of mischievous nonsense when it comes to that. There are other factors that play a role in maintaining potassium levels. I'll go into it shortly. Cats that received the same diet supplemented with potassium did not develop hypokalemic polymyopathy, spontaneous recoveries of affected cats was not associated consistently with increases in plasma potassium concentrations. Plasma taurine concentrations decreased, and glutamic acid increased markedly in all cats fed the experimental diet. That's really, this is why when you're on a kibble diet, glutamate, especially in the brain, which is excitatory and in high concentrations can be neurodamaging, sort of explains the sort of erratic behavior of vegans. Not enough taurine. Taurine increases GABA and actually lowers glutamic acid. Increase associated, with the high glutamic acid intake. Veterinarians should be aware that clinical disease and episodes of polymorphism are recurring after periods of simultaneous clinical recovery. This condition in cats may be a useful animal model for familial hypokalemic periodic paralysis in humans. Yes, these old people who are eating kibble. And the other thing is not able to hold on to the damn stuff inside the cell. I wonder why. Let's just take a look at this Russian study. Now, I don't have a copy of this, and it's one that I came across ages ago, 1986. I've tried to find it and all that to go right through the whole lot, but unfortunately, I haven't been able to find. It would be very interesting because of the findings that this Russian study had. And its effects on taurine, on potassium, calcium, sodium levels in the blood and tissue of rats. Effects of taurine on content of electrolytes was studied in rats. Myocardium, which is the muscle of the heart muscle. Liver tissue, doesn't need to be explained. They usually say hepatic tissue or something like that, but anyway. Skeletal muscle and erythrocytes, red blood cells. Anyway, the balanced electrolyte state of a body was impaired by administration of adrenaline at an arrhythmogenic dose. So they actually induced arrhythmia, like severe arrhythmia with adrenaline. While content of potassium in erythrocytes was altered by means of the addition of adrenaline. So they added more adrenaline to basically reduce the sort of potassium levels, or they used p-chloromencuribezole, which is basically a protease inhibitor. Protease is the one that cleaves off proteins. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. Into the incubation medium. Taurine was shown to normalize the content of potassium and calcium ions in vivo and in vitro. So in a petri dish and an animal model, they were able to see this normalization. And that's what it does because it's an osmolyte. It regulates those things, even at the kidney level, at the cell level, it regulates. So at the kidney level, it will actually help in recycling more potassium or calcium or reducing them. And this goes for sodium and everything else. This is the magic of a regulator. So when you take that out of the diet, you no longer can regulate these electrolytes properly. It's another reason why veganerized people have problems in this regard. Also run the risks of other disorders. In some cases, when they're consuming things like avocados and others that are very high in potassium, they can mask that problem. But ultimately, if they're eating a more, deranged diet, they're going to have problems. Long term, most of them do have these derangements, these increases in excitatory glutamate. So they do have derangements of different sorts. It depends on the the composition of the actual vagutarized diet. So you'll get different effects as a consequence. But the key thing here is that taurine basically is the thing that's regulating the potassium, even the calcium and a number of the other electrolytes. And that's the important thing. And it's doing it at the kidney level. So it is an osmolyte and it's really important. And people seem to forget this importance. Now, let's go back to that study. Now that you've got that covered, so, obviously these people, older people, usually nowadays in particular, are having these conditions. Why? Because they're on deficient diets. It's not, unfortunately, we don't do studies on elderly people to look at their diet profile and all that. And I have to do these extrapolations by looking at all these other studies and trying to, connect the dots, so to speak. We should really be doing studies on elderly people and looking at their dietary intake, and we should be making modifications and seeing the results of that. But we're not doing it, unfortunately. And this is why a lot of people that end up in nursing homes tend to not live very long, tend to basically decline more rapidly. Let's put it that way. Especially if it's not a nursing home, because there are different types. There are, those sort of centers where you've got a bit of autonomy, you can run, you can cook your own stuff and do your own thing. And then there's the ones where you're fed and this is what you're given, and they tend to be more problematic. Anyway, now let's look at this. So attention was first drawn to the clinical condition by observation of 3 adult cats. They were fed a human commercial vegetarian diet as part of an experiment to induce taurine deficiency retinopathy. So, these people are quite well aware, even back in this time, in the 90s, they were quite well aware. This is in Australia, Australian Veterinary Journal. Quite well aware that some of the commercial products out there actually induce this problem and actually can cause eye problems for cats. It's ridiculous. However, plasma amino acid profile of the cats showed increases in glutamic acid concentrations in the addition to the expected reduction in taurine concentrations. Exactly. When there's lower concentrations of taurine, glutamate goes up. This is the reason why people actually, when they go on a carnivore diet, they become calmer. Bipolar conditions and all these other things seem to miraculously heal themselves. The magic of, and especially when people are doing, I know that certain people that have had conditions do a raw animal-based one, they end up getting more taurine levels and they actually see better results, and they're out there claiming that and all that. The reality is they're probably very highly deficient in taurine. That's why. Anyway, here is an interesting, when we look at this, oops, this is just talking about the concentration through the different periods. I'm not going to go into that. And people can look at these themselves. As you can see, these are plasma concentrations, so in the blood, so to speak. So here we have, for instance, supplemented and unsupplemented. Look at the effects. So here they've actually, in the one that they've supplemented potassium, they've actually given slightly less taurine. And look at the glutamate level, slightly higher. They give the taurine, glutamate level, and many of the others are further down, which also means that indicates 1, less excitatory effect, 2, less of these aminos from breakdown of muscle. Then they remove completely the taurine. Here, the potassium is helping a bit, but still, you look at, there's, in the unsupplemented, there's massive rise. and glutamates are through the roof. Here it's, like with the taurine, you're about, what is it, about 1800 millimoles. Here, it's over 3,000, it's like 3,800 or whatever, so it's double that, more than double. So you can see the difference that even in terms of the breakdown of muscle tissue, plus the muscle damage and stuff like that, plus excitatory glutamate can go through the roof. It sort of explains the sort of deranged behavior of some of the vegans out there, or people on kibble diets, why they have all these autonomic, problems where their bodies are not functioning properly. The way they walk, the way they move, or the way they talk, or gestures and all that. There are issues there. Could it be a deficiency in taurine? And when we're talking about taurine, we actually mean animal protein. We're talking about animal protein. This is vegetarian protein. This is kibble. This is the future. This is the future for the whole of humanity if the food industry gets its way. Now, obviously, up to about the age of 65, you can still produce a certain level of endogenous taurine, which will mask the problem. Then it falls off the cliff. We're going to see 65-year-olds and over are going to be crashing in the future. The more kibble they eat, crashing and badly. And we'll be scratching our heads and wondering, what is causing this? It's a meat deficiency. That's what's causing it. And pretty much they do talk about, that, and it will also be associated with certainly taurine deficiency for periods greater than 1 year is known to cause feline cardiomyopathy, and it's also been associated with hypokalemia, which is low potassium, in cats fed commercial diets containing inadequate taurine concentrations. So they know this. There's other research here as well that actually shows this. This is veterinary research. It's not human research, it's veterinary research, but it actually is quite clear. And the other one, that was the Russian one, where they've looked at that. Unfortunately, we don't have like these sort of long-term trials, but we do see some of these behaviors, some of these patterns in humans as well. So we're talking about mammals here, and taurine's, fundamental to all mammals and all eukaryotic cells millions of years back. So it doesn't surprise because it's regulating fluids, it's regulating electrolytes. So why would it basically not be an issue in humans as well? Just because we don't have the research? Unfortunately, in some of these areas, research in animals is much better because animals are worth money. And so we research animals to fix their issues, where humans, it's best to keep them sick so we can actually extract money from them. Anyway, and so they say induces depletion, and this effect is exacerbated by the diet that contains, all these other sort of things that have negative balance on potassium balance. That's not the really issue. These acidophiles or whatever, your pH remains. That's a bit nonsense. It's regulated by the kidneys with ions being removed or added. So that's a bit of a misdirect as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, it's obviously that basically taurine deficiency is causing these problems. they pretty much marked increasing glutamic acid in cats. In all cats in this study, undoubtedly reflect the high proportion of this amino acid in the 2 vegetarian diets. Yes. Found the kittens were fed 9 to 12% glutamic acid, developed clinical signs of thiamine deficiency. So, and this is the other thing is, you've probably heard Elliot and many other people talk about thiamine deficiency. There is a relationship between thiamine deficiency, too much glutamic acid, and also low taurine levels. Your taurine, your thiamine requirements, and even when you actually try to push thiamine levels very high with supplements, you're not getting resolution because there's an underlying taurine deficiency, which is basically increasing glutamic acid, and it's the glutamic acid axis that is actually depleting your thiamine. You need to fix it with taurine. And that's the problem. A lot of people out there may be overcooking their meat, depleting the amount of taurine in their diet. Many low carb, keto type people don't consume enough. You know, again, the fear of protein, this sort of illogical sort of fear of protein, even though all the research shows it does not cause any problems. You're not going to basically increase your blood sugar levels and all that. The only time that's going to happen is when you no longer have any body fat on you, you know, very little. We're talking about starvation modes. But the fear of protein is what drives people away from it. And as a consequence, not enough taurine, we can basically induce a thiamine deficiency as well. Now, the thiamine requirements are half that on a carnivore diet because you're only using, you know, for fat and for protein, you're only using one enzymatic pathway, not both, compared to glucose metabolism. And using as a you know, source of energy, ATP. But when you're actually looking at an animal-based diet, the requirements for thiamine go half. But if you're deficient in taurine, you can induce a deficiency in thiamine. And that's where the thing is. Another reason why, if you look at older tribal populations and all that, they consume a certain amount of raw meat and freshly cut meat, which is fresh off the animal. Something we don't do now because we slaughter them in slaughterhouses, then we hang them up, which means that they lose some of their fluids, which means that they lose some of that taurine. Then they're basically packaged, put into packaging sort of environment, they lose more fluids. And then by the time you get it, and if you overcook it, it's not going to be as much as there should be. And that's where the difference is, where somebody who has a completely raw gets improvements in gut, mental, and other things, and somebody who overcooks it, or even, you know, that doesn't get enough and may be deficient, then they can struggle a bit more. Others also, there's also, if you're younger, you can still cope because you've still got that enzymatic pathway. So you can still, from methionine to glycine to taurine, you can still convert. So if you have quite a lot of meat, you can do the conversion and get your taurine endogenously. You can actually increase the amount produced by more methionine. But most people fear too much protein, so they don't get enough to basically provide through that, let alone, you support with additional methionine their methylation cycle. So all these factors are at play that affect and cause deficiencies. But the take-home message is, when it comes to frailty, taurine plays a big damn role, guys. When it comes to all these other sort of neurological, peripheral neuropathy issues and stuff like that, again, taurine's playing a role there. I mean, it's neuroprotective. I haven't actually done I will be doing a few more videos in regards to the neuroprotectiveness in the brain, and the nerve system and the peripheral nerve system as well. So it will basically make more sense as we go along and look at this magical compound that is in meat and seafood, which a lot of us are not getting enough because we're not eating enough meat or enough seafood. Unfortunately, nowadays, we still fear meat. We still have a fear of protein, and a lot of us took a long time to overcome our fear of fat, but a lot of us still have a fear of protein, especially if you've been indoctrinated through the low carb community. And it's another reason why people have all these electrolyte issues in the keto community, again, for these sort of reasons, or have thiamine issues again and again. They avoid the richest source of thiamine and niacin. Little piggy, exactly, piggy, exactly. They avoid the pork, again, for illogical reasons that comes from you could say the paleo community, and to a larger extent where that original attitude against the piggy sort of emerged. And certain seafood that we don't consume as much nowadays that are also high in thiamine as well. So there are a lot of reasons for these sort of things. But the take-home message is that at the nexus of a lot of these things and the regulation of a lot of these things in the body, our dear friend taurine is right at the middle of that whole nexus. So if you're deficient in taurine, you're going to have some of these problems. And that's why, a lot of my subs now that are consuming a bit of taurine supplemental, like I do, have noticed no more cramps, no more this and that, stomach issues. All these things seem to be receding. Sometimes it can take longer for some people than others, depending on how deranged and how many conditions they have. But eventually they do see a lot of improvements. Depends on the dose that's required for different conditions. So usually I do ask people to either send me an email or to leave comments, so I can actually, where they've given me some good information in terms of their pre-existing condition or some history and stuff like that. In those sort of cases, it's best to sort of, when you don't want to sort of a generalized thing, you want something specific, it's best to give me an email. Now, obviously, I'm behind on my emails, so it will take a bit of time, but eventually I will get to it, and you will get a better dosage for your specific condition. So I don't recommend the same dosages for everyone, depending on your conditions and all that. And I do actually remind people to tell me their weight, height, and stuff like that, so I can determine dosages for your size as a human. So that's important as well. So do not neglect to provide that additional information in your emails. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and to sort of understand how the sort of frailty conditions, their causes, how we see them in these animal models, but also how we see them in humans. But unfortunately, we ignore them because there's more benefit to medicate them than rather help them fix their problems by addressing their meat deficiency. Anyway, see yous.